pursuant to the Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Gordon.
Here.
Councilmember Fletcher. Councilmember Fletcher. Councilmember Cunningham.
Present.
Councilmember Osman.
Here.
Councilmember Goodman.
Present.
Vice President Jenkins. Vice President Jenkins. Councilmember Cano.
Here.
Council President Bender.
Here.
Councilmember Schrader.
Here.
Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Palmisano.
Present.
Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Fletcher.
Here.
Council Vice President Jenkins. Councilmember Johnson. Chair Ellison.
Present.
There are 10 members present.
Let the record reflect that we do have a quorum. Colleagues, as I mentioned, we're here in our capacity as the city's canvassing board in order to canvass the returns on 2 ballot questions proposing amendments to the city charter, which were referred to the voters as at this year's general election. I will first entertain a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
Move approval, Mr. Chair.
Do we have a second?
Second.
I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on that motion.
Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Gordon.
Aye.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Aye.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Aye.
Councilmember Osman.
Aye.
Councilmember Goodman.
Aye.
Council Vice President Jenkins. Councilmember Cano.
Aye.
Council President Bender.
Aye.
Councilmember Schrader.
Aye.
Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Palmisano.
Aye.
Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Vice President Jenkins. Councilmember Johnson. Chair Ellison.
Aye. That carries and the agenda is adopted. Here to present the staff report to us is our city clerk, Casey Carl. Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you noted, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk for the city of Minneapolis. And in that capacity, I also serve as the city's chief elections official. May it please the board, as you noted, Mr. Chair, the purpose of this meeting is to canvass the returns on 2 questions that were referred to the electorate as part of this year's general election conducted on Tuesday, November 3rd. Before we move to specifics about those ballot questions, I wanted to provide just a little of context for this year's general election, which, as this body is well aware, was historic in many ways. We'll move to the next slide. On this slide, you can see a table with total turnout data from the presidential general election. And as shown, a total of 238,094 votes were cast. That's how many voters cast ballots in this year's general election. And that includes all of the absentee ballots cast during the 46-day early voting period, the ballots that were cast at the polls on election day, as well as those absentee ballots that were mailed in, postmarked by election day and received through November 10th. Highlighted in red on this chart, you can see that based on our total voting eligible population, Minneapolis achieved a turnout of 75.2%. And has been stated on many occasions, this represents the highest voter turnout in the city's history, eclipsing the previous record, which was set in the last presidential election of 2016 by more than 18,000 ballots. Not only did the city achieve a new record for voter turnout, but this year's election also associated from previous election years because it marked the first time that the majority of ballots were cast during the early voting period prior to Election Day. Certainly, concern with the potential risk of spread or exposure to COVID-19 virus was a significant factor driving absentee voting this year. I think the question will be if that convenience factor of absentee voting coupled with increased personal safety, which is offered by absentee balloting, will carry forward into future election years. The next slide, please. This next slide provides comparative turnout data for presidential elections from 1988 through 2020. And again, you can see this steady trend over the past 3 decades with increasing levels of participation. That, of course, does reflect increases in the city's general population during those decades, but certainly it also shows a greater percentage of our general population is participating in that most fundamental aspect of our representative democracy, which is voting. And in that regard, while I know we are all proud that Minneapolis leads the state of Minnesota and thus the United States in terms of voter engagement and participation, it has to be reiterated that this level of success could not be achieved, much less sustained and built over time, without the commitment of our dedicated team of full-time election professionals. And Minneapolis is incredibly fortunate to have our Elections and Voter Services Division led by Grace Waklerowicz, who make this level of engagement possible. This board knows I'm very proud of Ms. Waklerowicz and her entire team. And that includes the thousands of individuals who serve as the core of our election judges, our seasonal staff, and our temporary workers. We simply could not have achieved this record of success without them. And so at this point, Mr. Chair, it's my pleasure to introduce our elections director, Grace Waklerowicz, who will summarize the 2 ballot questions that were referred to the electorate as part of this year's general election and the results of each of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carl, and Ms. Waklerowicz, thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. My name is Grace Waklerowicz, and as the clerk noted, I am the Director of Elections and Voter Services. I am here to present the unofficial results from the 2 ballot questions amending the city charter that were part of the 2020 general election. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute Section 410.12, any question seeking to amend a city charter requires at least 51% of those voting on the question must favor of its adoption to be passed. If successfully adopted, the amendment becomes legally effective 30 days after the date of the election. This slide shows the ballot question 1 concerning redistricting and the subsequent timing of elections of council members. Specifically, under state law, a regular election for all wards must be conducted in a year ending in 2 or 3 following each redistricting using the new population data generated by the census. Those terms would be for a single 2-year term in order to ensure the alignment with the unified municipal ballot after adjusting for that one-time fix. This is a cycle that repeats every 20 years. As you can see from this slide, a total of 189,441 ballots were cast that were either had a yes or no marked. These are the ballots that constitute the total pool of ballots tabulated for that question. Of that total, 142,777 ballots supported passage of the question, which was just over 75% of the qualifying ballots. Since that was more than the minimum 51% required for passage, ballot question number 1 is passed and is adopted. That ordinance, having been referred to the voters, therefore becomes effective on Thursday, December 3rd. Next slide, please. The second ballot question concerns the timing of special municipal elections with the purpose of aligning with the limited number of dates that are allowed under state election law. Those uniform dates for any special municipal election are the first Tuesdays in the months of February, April, or May of any year, or in conjunction with the date of the state primary in August, or the date of the state general election in November. No other dates for special elections are permitted. As you can see on this slide, a total of 189,621 ballots were cast that either had a yes or no marked on this question. These are the ballots that constitute the total pool of ballots tabulated for that question. Of that total, 164,883 ballots supported passage of the question, which was just over 86% of the qualifying ballots. Ballot question number 2 is passed and is adopted. That ordinance, having been referred to the voters, therefore becomes effective on Thursday, December 3rd. Staff have prepared an order for the board which will certify these results as being official. The order also directs the city clerk to file the final certified results with the proper county and state authorities and to retain the official election results and records as required by state law. With that, Mr. Chair, I have concluded my presentation and am happy to stand for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from my colleagues? I'm not seeing any questions. So again, thank you, Mr. Carl. Thank you, Ms. Waklerowicz, for the presentation. And I just want to echo Mr. Carl's gratitude to all of the work that went into these elections. The demand was high, the barriers were high, and you would have thought that maybe that would have triggered a little bit of a downturn in our participation, and yet we saw this rise, and absolutely, of course, there are a lot of factors that go into that. The presidential election is very popular. This one was very popular, but I absolutely agree with the clerk that there's no way we can get this kind of participation without extremely well run, extremely competently run and led elections from our department. So thank you. With that, I will move to adopt the order that certifies as official the canvass returns from the 2 municipal elections on the 2020 general election ballot and direct the clerk to make the filings of those official results as required by law, all as reflected in the staff report. And the clerk will call the roll on that motion.
Councilmember Reich. Councilmember Gordon.
Aye.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Aye.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Aye.
Councilmember Osman.
Aye.
Councilmember Goodman.
Aye.
Vice President Jenkins.
Aye.
Councilmember Kano.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
Councilmember Schrader.
Aye.
Councilmember Johnson.
Aye.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Aye.
Councilmember Reich. Chair Ellison.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. That carries and that order has been adopted. Before we conclude, I see that Councilmember Cunningham has put his name in the queue, and so I'll give him a moment. I hope I didn't miss you earlier, Councilmember.
No, that's totally okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to echo gratitude. What we saw and still really are seeing post this election is election officials across the country being attacked and our democracy being undermined in the process. And I just really want to make sure that we take a moment to recognize that we have some of the best election officials in the country. We are incredibly fortunate here in Minneapolis to have the leadership that we have in our elections office. The integrity of the work is never questioned. It's clear that the work that is done with such professionalism, done with such commitment to a healthy, thriving democracy in our city. I've said it before, and I just want to say it again. As an elected official, one of the things that I've never had to worry about is clearing barriers for people, for my constituents to vote. And that is such a blessing. We have colleagues, local elected officials across the country who are fighting with their local elected, their local election officials, trying to clear barriers, make sure that there's enough polling places, making sure that there aren't unnecessary barriers. We have folks who have done everything in their power to make voting as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And as a result, we see that we have the nation's highest turnout. That is phenomenal, and that is truly a blessing that we have here in Minneapolis that we cannot take for granted. So I just want to say thank you again to the folks in the clerk's office, Mr. Clerk himself. Thank you all so much for what you do. We are truly blessed in Minneapolis to have you in these roles doing this phenomenal work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. Quickly before we adjourn, speaking of not taking our staff for granted, I just wanted to express on behalf of the entire City Council our sincere appreciation for Grace and her team. That goes to Tim Schwartz, Kate Redden, John Martin, Eric Jeffries Burns, Jeff Narrabrook, and Aaron Grossman, as well as the thousands of election judges, seasonal staff, and temporary workers who made this entire year of elections possible, especially the presidential election, which I believe is one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime, this past presidential election. So that you pulled this off during the middle of a global health pandemic makes this a success, I think, so much more incredible than any typical year. So with that, and seeing no further business before this board, we are adjourned. Thank you.